So I just finished my first meal there, which was first of the nachos from last night. I eat them cold, when I put them away, which is a different experience, but no less delicious. It's mostly because I don't want to microwave this Caesar for obvious reasons. You ever tried to microwave Caesar dressing? It's not good stuff. Anyways, so this is the Richard Wolf. Um, uh, where am I at now? I'm in September. Um, September 2014 update. And that was about when they had the fast food strikes in the United States. Um, and so he's talking about the minimum wage and the inequality attached to the low minimum wage. I'm gonna go off on a little bit of a tangent um, regarding this, and I'm gonna start off on terms that may seem a little right wing, and end on terms that are exceedingly left wing. Um, so let's not. What I'm skipping is the middle. I'm skipping the liberalism. I'm going to throw down some perspectives that are going to be maybe disappointing, but in the end, I'm going to come out somewhere to the left of Marx. So let's 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 get those expectations down before I no doubt shatter you. Um, do I think they should raise the minimum wage? Well, I already put down the reality that it's not going to cause job losses, but um, it may not be as fair as you think, and it may not have the outcome that you desire. Not because it's going to lead to lost jobs, but because it's going to lead to inflation. Um, and inflation has some bad effects. We also went over how printing money doesn't really lead to inflation. But what actually leads to inflation? Um, I mean, there's acts of God. If there's a rainstorm in California, the price of strawberries will go up. But um, those things are largely temporary. And then you have the consequences of oligopolies, like in oil, where inflation and deflation is just manipulated. It's just determined by the um, aims of armies and investors, and there's no the price reflects what the bastards want the price to be. There's no real market. There's no real market in gold. There's no real market in oil, and there's no real stock market. It's all heavily manipulated by a small group of exceedingly wealthy investors and by governments who have geopolitical aims. So, for example, the United States has recently driven the price of oil down. The reason the United States has driven the price of oil down is because they want to reduce the amount of money that the Russians can make from oil exports, which has managed to piss off the Saudis, and et cetera, right? But commodities of that nature, like that, there's no real market. It's so heavily manipulated that you can't even call it a market. It's just the plaything of the rich and powerful, right? So you will see inflation and deflation based on those terms. That used to be the case with the dollar, but then we created this wonderful thing called the Federal Reserve, um, and centralized banking, which made it impossible for the wealthy to fuck with the dollar like that. And it's a great thing, and we should all be gratefully thankful that the Federal Reserve exists, because otherwise the dollar would go up and down like the price of oil. Um, and maybe it might be worthwhile for people to think of a similar system applied to oil, um, which would require it would require centralized ownership of oil, or at least people to come together and drop the competitive aspects. I mean, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but it would be beneficial to everybody. Um, and then the price of energy, as it fluctuates, it changes the price of goods, right? That's a big factor in inflation is the price of energy, and it's just determined by how the bastards want to fuck with things, right? There's no economic laws. There's no way to figure it out beforehand. It's just you know pure manipulation, right? Um, but the other thing that drives inflation is when you have various policies that increase prices, right? Increase costs. You could introduce a tax that'll create inflation, um, or you could mandate that companies have to increase their wages. That will increase inflation. Now let's keep in mind that we have that down, and remember, this is just off the cuff ranting. I didn't write any of this down. Um, so I'm ordering it, on the fly in my mind. But the inflation thing, let's keep that in mind. Let's put that aside and let's go to the next point. Um, when you look at the minimum wage jobs, kind of the classic right wing argument is that it's all just a bunch of kids. And why are we paying kids a living wage? The correct response is that that's not actually true. If you look at the people that are working minimum wage, a lot of them are older. A lot of them have degrees. It's the reality of it. And a lot of them have kids, right? And so this idea of a living wage comes up. And a living wage is how much it costs for an adult to live in a specific city, right? And that's all very much reasonable. I think everybody agrees that people should have living wages. Um, but where the issue runs into problems is when you decide that you should give children a living wage. Um, now you might argue, well, so what? Maybe the 17-year-old kid is making enough money to, you know, live in an apartment in downtown New York. Um, so what? They can put some money aside, they can spend it on things. Why are we begrudging this? Well, the problem is that it creates inflation, right? And ultimately, once all of the once everything's bounced around all over the place, um, when we get to the end of it, the kids end up better off, and the adults don't, right? Um, because everything realigns itself in such a way um, that um, okay. So here's an example of how this would work. You double the minimum wage from 7.50 to 15, and you have um, a bunch of kids that are working at a Burger King or McDonald's or something else along those lines pass over in age from 18 to 19 or something like that. And they're making enough money from their job at Burger King that they want to get an apartment. So they look at the apartment levels that are on, or they look at the apartments that are on the market, right? What the people running the apartments, the rentiers, um, being the real benefiters of all inflation is always the rentier class, right? Um, they're going to look at the market and say, well, if the minimum wage is set at $15 an hour, then that means that I can increase the amount that I want to list this apartment for because now people that make minimum wage have more money. And they're going to look at possible tenants, right? Let's say that you have um, two groups of people that are applying for the apartment. Okay. One of them is two young people. They both work minimum wage jobs. It's a two-bedroom apartment, and so they want to share the apartment. Another is a single mother with a child, with one child, so she needs a two-bedroom apartment, and she has one income. It would be rational for the rentier to rent to the people with a higher amount of disposable income because that's more stable, right? If you rent to the mother with the child, it's only one income. If she loses her job, um, you know. So what you're doing is you're putting adults in competition with children, and the children will win every time. So if what you're trying to argue is that the minimum wage increase is beneficial or is necessary because we have all of these adults living in poverty and they need more money to get by, and it's a universal wage increase, so everybody gets the same increase, then the end result doesn't actually accomplish anything because you've still got all these kids with all this money now, and they're going to drive inflation up, and that's going to, in the end, stabilize everything. This is like I say, this is an ad hoc argument. Um, if you really, 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 really want me to, we can sit down together, and we can work out some numbers. But um, I wave my hands with these things, like a good egghead always does, um, and it's true. I mean, you can do the math yourself if you'd like. It's accurate, right? Um, so what does that really imply when you think about it? Well, it implies two things. The first is that you've got an issue where you're combining two ideas into one idea, and it's creating an impossible situation that you'll never get out of. Okay, if you have a living wage and a minimum wage as the same thing, then there will never be a living wage. And the reason is that an adult trying to raise kids or do whatever else and live on their own in an economy is not the same thing as a child living in a basement, or even just kind of starting off on their own, right? And so these ideas need to be separated somehow, okay? And that needs to be kind of a major focus of the pushback. Okay, workers need to realize that these are two different things. Okay, and as long as they're treated as the same thing, it's impossible, right? Meaning that there should be, at the very least, two different wage structures here. Okay, there should be a concept called a living wage, which is paid to adults that are, that need that, and then there's a concept called a minimum wage, or it may be a student wage um, that's paid to kids, right? And that's really the only way to separate these things out in such a way that will prevent, inflation from taking away all the gains um, that are won. Now, I think that once you kind of get that point down, once you realize that, right, then the next step is to realize that this is just an instant of a broader sort of concern, and that the whole idea of universalizing wages is itself a problem. What I'm doing is I'm saying that adults and children have different needs. And so this minimum wage, this fast food strike is unfortunately, I think, just another example of the left losing touch with itself. Um, this is kind of a theme in a lot of my writings and my ramblings, is this idea that the left has lost the plot. What are fast food strikes about? They're just about raising income, right? A lot of people have asked the question over the last couple of years, why has the left never organized fast food workers before, or retail workers, or anything like that? And the reason is that there's no structural benefit to doing so. Okay, back when the left had a plot, and wanted to get to a system called communism, um, the idea of unionizing workers was about taking control of production and eliminating the rentier class, getting rid of the bosses, right? Um, and if that's your goal, well then what do fast food workers don't produce anything that's going to get the revolution anywhere. And if the entire focus of the left has moved to fighting for higher workers, for servants, for slaves, then it's given up on the revolution. You don't start a revolution by organizing fast food workers. That will get you nowhere. Nowhere at all. But even so, they're making the wrong argument. They're missing the point. And that is that the only way that you're ever going to stabilize this is to, instead of saying this is what a minimum wage is, and so everybody should get at least this wage, regardless of what their needs are. What you need to do is you need to look at people on a family by family basis and say, or on an individual by individual basis, and say, these are your needs, therefore your wages should reflect that. What does that mean? Well, that means that your single mother would be compensated relative to her needs, which are more than your high school, your recent high school graduate. And then you would have this tiered system of minimum wages for kids that are getting their first job and should be paid less, and then a living wage for people that need to live, right? In a world that have to pay rent to, got to pay rent to their landlord. They got to pay rent to their cable company. They got to pay rent to their insurance company, right? Of course, we could try to minimize rent while we're at it, but the key to actually getting the plot back in place and getting this moving in a more of a left-wing direction rather than just accepting the status quo that we will have servants and they will be paid a wage, okay, is to realize that it can't be about wages. It has to be about needs. And so long as it is about wages, it isn't really you're tilting at windmills. You're being at the moon. Okay? Because inflation will reverse everything you're fighting for. and then the bastards win, right? You just get perpetual class struggle, okay, with no endpoint, with no output, no way out. So this kind of a tangent. I think that Mr. Wolf would largely agree with what I'm saying. It's not really what he's saying, but it got me thinking about it when I was listening to him.